Welcome to the Innovation Storytellers Podcast. We talk to innovators and disruptors in R&D, product managers, entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs, innovation thought leaders, and their storytellers who help bring their amazing ideas to life. Now, here's your host, innovation storyteller, CEO, speaker, and coach to the world's top innovation teams, Susan Lindner.
Hi, I'm Susan Lindner, and I'm the host of Innovation Storytellers. For the last 20 years, I've been helping innovators and disruptors to tell their stories. 10 acquisitions, hundreds of innovative products and services later, countless hockey stick growth curves in both directions. I just wanted to share how great innovations get to market and inviting some of my favorite innovators around the world to share their stories. Stories are what paved the way to get these great innovations through the meat grinder of the corporate world. And I love having people on who can tell us how they tell these stories, either from inside the company or helping companies from the outside looking in. So I'm super excited today to have with me Scott Kirsner, who is the indefatigable leader of Innovation Leader, which is, I think, the bellwether. It's the publication that we all look to in the innovation space for understanding what are the current trends, what are other big companies doing in the space to create more innovative products and services, and also become aware of the trends that are taking around us that might even disrupt the innovation that's going on inside of our companies. So I want to share a little bit about Scott. And Scott, I hope you'll also share with me some of the things that your lovely bio is neglecting to share, the stuff that you know that the rest of us perhaps don't know from just a cursory understanding of your work. So you've been running Innovation Leader for more than a decade, but prior to this, you were also working as a journalist for the Boston Globe, and taking into account some of what's happening, not just on the Boston scene, but bringing the international scene of innovation to us. You've also had an incredible experiences working out in Hollywood with things like places like Lucasfilm and some of the great innovators in the Hollywood space, and real incredible storytelling that takes place in motion pictures, but also bringing innovation to that which is the movies. And so, Scott, welcome to Innovation Storytellers, first and foremost. And tell us how you got into the crazy game of innovation, because none of us measured in innovation. So how did you get there?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, first of all. And it's funny, I have been decorating my Zoom background with some different objects. And as a kid, I grew up having an Apple IIe computer, which is the motherboard that's over my left shoulder, I guess. And so I was always interested in learning how to program and how computers were going to be connected. And really the way that I got into innovation was in the early days of the web, having a job where part of it was thinking about how the web was going to impact large companies. I was working at a management consulting firm at the time. So like, how would the web impact their big clients, and how was this consulting firm going to present itself on the web? And then getting from there into journalism and working at the Boston Globe, which at the time was owned by the New York Times Company. We were a division of a publicly traded company. And I was part of this team that was charged with like, hey, can you help us figure out the business model for digital publishing and what we should start with and how to like engage users? And so those were kind of the stepping stones for me into thinking about these waves of innovation that we experience as people, and what role do startups play in those waves, and also how do big companies try to surf those waves.
And in your understanding, when you first come in, I imagine some of those waves really feel like a tsunami crashing over you, because you're in a big city newspaper that suddenly gets swallowed up by an even bigger city newspaper, well, really the national paper of record for the United States. And you're learning how to keep that innovative spirit alive in the midst of that acquisition. What do you think are some of the takeaways you garnered from that experience?
Well, I think when I went to work for it in the mid 90s, it had already been acquired by the New York Times, but was still kind of being integrated into that company. And then eventually the New York Times then sold it to the current owner. So it got spun out. And I do think many people who've been through acquisitions have the experience of like, there's a lot of attempts at technological and human resource integration and like making sure that disparate teams are working together. And it's a lot of effort, and it can sometimes find efficiencies and new ways to grow. And sometimes it just creates a lot of friction. And, in a way, I feel like acquisitions can often be the enemy of innovation because you're spending so much time trying to integrate and trying to figure out who do we need to throw overboard and who do we want to keep, that companies can take their eye off the ball a lot of the time. And the other thing that you touched on, I think, is really important, which is that large companies do often see these important waves coming. In the 90s, it was the wave of the web and consumers using the web. And today it might be things like the artificial intelligence wave, or wanting to use speech and our voice as an interface as opposed to typing things or punching buttons like we used to do on our touch-tone phones. And they know the wave is happening and they talk a lot about the wave happening, but they're not really doing enough. Like if you ask them like, where are their resources and how is their money being spent and what are people doing today about that wave? Often it's like the answer is not enough doing and a lot of talking. And so that's the real danger for large companies.
So part of the work that you do at Innovation Leader is bringing together the conferences and bringing together the content, frankly, that keep all of us abreast of what's going on in the innovation space. Seeing it as you have for so long, what do you think has changed since you first started running Innovation Leader until now? What are some of the shifts that you've seen along the way?
I mean, the biggest shift is just how quickly is about speed and money. And it's like startups have gotten so good at finding a tool set that will let them build something really quick, whether it's wireframe drawings and mock-ups, or it's like creating an app and actually putting into the app store and seeing how do consumers react, to 3D printing and other kinds of rapid prototyping, right? There's just this amazing set of tools where a startup can build something that either looks kind of like a real product or it is a real product. Kickstarter would be another example. Kickstarter and Indiegogo, like ways to sort of pre-sell new products that startups are really good at leveraging all of those tools and channels that gives them incredible speed to market. So that's one thing that has really changed. And the other thing is just how much money is going into the startup world right now. 2020 was a record amount of venture capital funding going into startups, and 2021 is going to be another record year. And so that gives large companies really a lot of pressure from outside. It's going to create more companies like SpaceX, right? Which just this past weekend sent more tourists into space for a couple days on that trip. And SpaceX has basically been kicking Boeing's butt at getting humans to the space station and getting cargo into orbit. And Boeing used to be one of those companies that like presidents would always brag about as like, this is the leading edge of innovation for America. And now Boeing is playing catch up to a startup, basically. And I think you're going to just see that in a lot more spaces where, because of the speed of building things and the availability of funding, big companies are either going to have to get better at competing with these startups or get better at investing in them, partnering with them, and acquiring them.
We've had so many innovation leaders on this show who say the money is here. It's what we do when a startup walks in the door that just crushes their little heart spirits. The ability to rapidly prototype something, or the ability to at least even test the market with Indiegogo, right? You can figure out what fails fast, much faster, and with less reputational risk than a giant behemoth company like a Boeing could, right? even doing it under the radar. I'm surprised, a lot of these companies haven't just set up stealth companies just to prototype and test their own stuff outside of the organization. But oftentimes, and I don't know if this happened with your experience between the New York Times and the Boston Globe, but little companies get squashed. They put up upon layers of cybersecurity, let's say, that a young startup has to have. Or we need to internationalize this prototype across 10 languages and 15 markets, see if it'll fly, not simply enough to see if it works. Is it your experience that that's another factor in the failure for large companies of becoming more agile in competing with startups or incorporating startups?
Yeah, I mean, it is a factor is that a lot of big companies want to treat startups like, hey, they're just, they're like any other vendor, right? And we're going to put them through the same security checks and risk and legal procurement process as we do when we buy something from Salesforce or when we buy something from Microsoft. It's interesting. We just did some research. So I do think what you're saying is basically one way to think about the startup world is they're all our competitors or they don't really matter because they're startups, which is a very old school way of looking at it. I think it's a dangerous way of looking at it. But another way is we could get really good and become known as like the partner of choice for startups. And so whether they're looking for some funding or whether they're looking for someone to help them get to market or let's co-develop a product, we want to be the best company, the first door that they knock on for doing that. Johnson & Johnson would be a good example of a company that I think has executed that strategy really well, where if you're in any of the biotech centers of the world right now, whether it's Boston or London or Palo Alto or Shanghai, there's a Johnson & Johnson team there that is like your connection to J&J. They will meet with you and give you feedback and help you potentially sign a co-development deal, sponsor you for lab space in a shared lab building if you have an interesting product that they may want to potentially take to market. So it's worth looking at the Johnson & Johnson innovation approach because I think they're trying to solve some of these problems. And the last thing I would say is that one thing you mentioned earlier, the slowness and how long big companies take to figure out how do they want to partner with a startup is the number one reason, according to some research we just published in collaboration with MIT. Slowness and how long the process takes is the top challenge that startups face when working with big companies. And surprisingly, like the legal and contractual stuff and the security and risk concerns are like way down the list of challenges. But number one is just slowness. And number two is getting introductions to the right person in the company. I think large companies always figure out that, or always believe that, oh, startups will figure out who the right contact is for their given product or their given solution. And the result is startups are really frustrated at having to send a lot of emails and a lot of LinkedIn messages and a lot of calls to eventually figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy of a big company.
Yeah, I work closely with GE and there are 300,000 employees. They're trying to figure out how to navigate that giant behemoth of a network it's unfathomable, really, trying to figure that out.
Yeah, it's somewhat easily solvable, which is like you could do what J&J Innovation does, which is like you have people that you can find on LinkedIn who are points of contact in different parts of the world whose LinkedIn roles describe what they do. And there's a J&J Innovation put up a website and just explain, here are the ways we interact with startups and here are some of the people you could reach out to. But for whatever reason, that feels too much like giving away trade secrets or making it too easy to be pitched for a lot of companies.
Yeah. A good friend of mine, a former client, left the biggest accelerator in France to go and run the innovation team for the Amazon of France. And I said, so what's the new job like after working for the last 10 years? And he said, basically, I send out an email with an innovative idea with 40 people CC'd on it. I then sit at my desk and wait 6 weeks for all of the machine to work its way through for someone to come back to me and say, we like it, let's do it. And so that 6-week time, he was like, is the difference between what would happen in a 24-hour period with my startup contingent in the accelerator and what is the natural course of action for a giant company. And I thought that was pretty indicative of what that transition looks like, all the conversation, all the mishigas around those emails back and forth to finally get to, okay, let's give it a shot.
Yeah. I think there are probably ways like that you could measure the pace. It'd be interesting to measure the pace of decision making at companies of different sizes. But yeah, I notice it when I email entrepreneurs in my life versus emailing people from larger companies. And it's the difference between do they answer email on Saturday or do they answer your email 6 weeks later?
That's right. That's right. So, is there anything else you want to share from that study? It sounds pretty fascinating. So, speed is one of the greatest differentiators from that. And then I think what I heard you say is that the corporate procurement, legal, cyber, security, all of that is further down the list on what's hindering innovation. Anything else that our audience should be aware of or could make some changes to?
Yeah. I think that one other thing that was interesting is just kind of like knowing what you're looking for in the startup realm. And one of the questions we asked in that research report was like, what is a quality startup to you? And so having thought about what problems are you trying to solve in your company is important. But the top two things that emerge from that question are it's a startup that already has built prototypes. So we're not talking to startups at the cocktail napkin stage of the idea or the PowerPoint stage of the idea. And then the second thing was already working with pilot customers. So by and large, these big companies are looking for startups that are not just two people in a garage with building the first prototype or putting together the PowerPoint deck. They want startups that are at a little bit more of a seasoned stage. And the other thing we learned from that research is really just how important it is to define the areas where you really want, where you feel like startups can help you and maybe have solutions, and to have some internal champions or contacts, right, that are ready to work with those companies so that you're not having like a really productive meeting or conversation with the startup and then trying to like go to the 300,000 employees of GE and say, who has a problem that this startup might be able to address? Because that's one of the things that really stretches out timeframes,
Yeah. And so, one of the things we talk about in innovation storytelling is that internal champion, the early adopter on the inside, and what it means to have someone, whether that's an in-house innovation or working with a startup, what that internal proponent means to the success of getting an innovation through the corporate meat grinder. Can you tell us a little bit about examples that you've seen of what it is to actually get that story told on the inside with people who are identifying the problem, connecting it with the solution, and then moving things forward? I know you've been exposed to so many different companies doing so many different things as a publisher and also an event organizer. How do we identify them and who's doing it well?
Those are a lot of really good questions. So I think that I try to oversimplify everything, right? And so sometimes the internal champion is somebody who gets hired from Silicon Valley or acquired through a startup. And it's like, oh, we're kind of knighting this person to be like our innovation warrior or innovation champion. And often that fails just because they're seen as too much of a shit disturber, I guess is the word that I'm thinking of, right? Like they want things to move too fast. They don't understand the internal landscape and they're viewed as an outsider, And so often those people after 2 years of trying and presenting some really good ideas get tossed out or they get so frustrated that they leave. And yet you don't want somebody who is like such a manager, culturally attuned that they don't have ideas or they can't make anything happen. So you kind of want someone in the middle, right? Who probably does have the network and understand the culture and knows where the pockets of power exist and potentially bring ideas from that startup world or maybe the latest Silicon Valley acquisition and help connect those to the large company. But I think that second category of like the insider who really has creativity and ideas and entrepreneurial stick-with-itness or stick-to-itiveness tends to work better as a formula. The company has to like have really defined like, here's how we want to change, right? There has to be a strategy that involves change as opposed to just like earnings growth and stuff that Wall Street wants to see. And so you do want some vision and some storytelling from the C-suite that creates a reason for this person to exist and to be putting together a team and a portfolio of projects internally. And the last thing I would say is like, it's part of what makes this series really important is that communication and storytelling and getting people's attention is so important. And it can be just getting people's attention to, hey, there is this disruptive startup that's nosing into our space. It can be a real change in consumer preference or buying patterns. It can be a change in materials and like, hey, we need to be 100% sustainable or recyclable materials. And we know that needs to happen now, not 3 years from now. And so there are lots of those changes that you need to focus on and need to communicate really well inside of a company. And often, I guess the last thing I would say is often you need to discover like new ways to tell those stories that are not just an article on the company intranet site or an email that goes out to everyone in the company. You need to do stuff like maybe audio and video storytelling. Maybe it's short, like TikTok length videos to get people's attention. We've even seen people, there was a guy that I met at Bechtel, which is this giant construction and engineering company. They had published a hardcover book of like innovation success stories of things they'd prototyped and things they'd rolled out to make the construction process of these giant bridges, dams, subway systems more efficient. I thought that was pretty cool to be able to drop like a hardcover book on someone's desk, customer or like an internal executive. The other example I'd mention is we ran into somebody from the insurance company Assurant, and they had created like a strategy board game that they got everybody in the company from the CEO on down to spend an hour playing as a way to understand like what are some of the changes in the world as far as how people buy insurance and why might that mean that like our company needs to do some things differently and think a little bit differently.
While you were talking about Bechtel and their amazing book of innovations, I was also remembering, I'm scratching my brain trying to think about what company this was that annually published a book of their failures, of everything that went wrong in the course of the innovation process and pass that around. And part of that was desire to create an innovation culture that didn't fear failure, that readily embraced the risk associated with innovation, knowing that they would get there faster, their failures. And I'm curious if you find that companies, are they paying lip service to that kind of resilience in the face of failure, or are some companies actually really good at owning their fails and getting up and going again?
I don't know. I mean, I think that professional sports is a pretty good model for like how you look at failure, right? Which is they do postmortems. I'm sure all the teams that just lost in the Sunday football games yesterday or the Saturday college football games, right? Like they'll review the video of the game and try to understand like where things went wrong and how we can do better next time. And so I think that ability to like look at failures and like what did we learn and how do we change our strategy going forward is really important. But nobody in sports talks about let's celebrate failure. Let's give a trophy to the worst linebacker on our team, or like who is the worst special teams player and how do we honor that person? And so I do think a lot of the rhetoric around let's celebrate failure and give out failure awards and publish things about failure, like I think that goes against the grain in most big companies. And like they want to win just like professional sports teams want to win. And so like what you really need to celebrate are those examples of things that we pilot tested that were successful and then they made it to market. Maybe you celebrate customers who kind of like highlighted an important opportunity that you then created a solution for. Like, I just don't think focusing too much on failure is a good idea. And I don't even think saying the word failure is such a good idea, or trying to like own the word failure as part of innovation that's smart, to be honest.
Does it feel like an anathema to the corporate culture? Like it flies in the face of everything everybody's pulling toward.
Everybody wants to move past failure and on to success, right? Like your performance review and the salespeople loving you is all about like giving them stuff that can help them succeed. And so I think in sports too, like nobody wants to be the team that ends the season at 1-17 or whatever. So yeah, I think that it's a little bit too, that the idea of celebrating failure is probably not a path that you should go too far down or spend too many resources on.
Huh. And yet, everyone must have a winner and a loser, right? There must be a failure inherent in every game played.
That's true.
I was listening to one of our guests, Mark Ollard from Amazon Web Services, was talking about a town hall meeting that he was at with Jeff Bezos. And one of the new employees raised his hand and boldly asked a question. Hey, Jeff, how badly did we screw up the Amazon Fire phone? They had a whole phone that was intended. I think that it was the Fire phone. There was a combined mobile phone with Prime ordering capabilities. And the first said was, we need to do a grand scale with those things. And I thought, that's bold. And certain other guests have talked about other failures that they've experienced. And yet there's something about at least being able to name it, own it, and move on that creates some kind of safety for innovators to at least take the risk, right?
Yeah. But I actually feel like maybe part of the issue here is that, yes, there are winners and sometimes there are permanent winners and losers in the corporate world, but often it's very transitory. And I would highlight, if you look at the way Amazon, Google, and Disney all played in internet video, right? Like they all had some pretty early failures in realizing that like, hey, video is going to become a digital thing. It's not always going to be videotapes or DVDs or films shown in movie theaters. And so over the course of like 15 years or so, they all had failed experiments in trying to deliver video over the internet or to like a set-top box that you would have on your TV. And the reason that we would point to Amazon, Google, and Disney as really smart companies is they actually learned from the failure and didn't put it on the shelf and consider it a dead project. They learned and they're like, okay, let's try something else, right? So Amazon had a product I remember covering called Unbox that was basically like a way to deliver video to their customers. It predated Amazon Prime Video, and it had a lot of things that people didn't like about it. It obviously didn't have a huge audience because they were in it very early. Google had their own product called Google Video, and it failed, but it did a lot of stuff like pay-per-view or pay-per-video download stuff that was worth trying. And from that failure, Google learned like, oh, we should acquire YouTube. And they went and bought YouTube because that was the successful disruptor in internet video. And Disney also had a handful of failures that they learned from, but then kept moving to now where they have Disney Plus, which really has helped drive the company's been one of the few bright spots during the pandemic for Disney.
Yeah. So us back to the left coast, we say here in New York, which is in Hollywood, experiences in the film industry, both from the storytelling side, but also just watching nascent innovators in that arena in the entertainment space pop up. And, as you and I were talking about our interview today, you were describing how Hollywood seems like it's this breakthrough place, right? Where there's always new CGI and there's always some cool new thing coming out. And I remember just watching The Matrix the first time and I was like, is this really happening? Like, couldn't even believe it. But when you were there, you confronted kind of firsthand what slow moving, let's keep things in the status quo way of things felt like, right? And you're going, come on, let's move. Tell us a little bit about that experience from a Hollywood perspective and set us up. Where are you and when are you and so forth?
Well, I moved out to San Francisco like in 2005 to work on a book project that was part of this publishing arrangement that George Lucas and Lucasfilm had set up to do some nonfiction books. And the like thesis of that book was like, let's look at the ways that innovation and technology has impacted the movie industry, but also the way the movie industry has fought new ideas almost from the very beginning. Thomas Edison, who helped invent the very first, they were called kinetoscopes. You would look into them and, put a nickel in and turn a crank and things like that. He didn't believe in projected movies. He just thought that was going to be too small of a market to mess around with. So even from the very beginning, you had Edison, like the paragon of innovation in America, saying like, I don't think movie projectors, not big enough market to worry about.
He didn't get the popcorn connection. That's
right.
He was really only thinking of the tech as opposed to like the jujubes and the goobers and all the stuff that goes along with great movie watching.
Yeah, popcorn and nachos. I don't know. I think this convention still exists.
Nachos.
There's a great convention in Vegas that I used to go to when I was writing about the industry called Show West. And the trade show floor is basically like all kinds of unhealthy food that the vendors are trying to sell to the snack bars, and they give out samples. It's really pretty great. But what I was doing in San Francisco, like, was working on that book. And so doing a lot of interviews of directors and cinematographers and movie editors and some movie stars and studio heads. And then I also was writing for Hollywood Reporter and Variety about how the Silicon Valley companies were affecting LA. And the stuff that winds up being an interesting example for other industries are the studios were full of people who were very accomplished business people getting paid really well with beautiful offices and, chauffeured cars and just an enormous sense of status. But they didn't really think too much about what the next disruption might be. It was always about incrementalism. It was like, oh, we can shift from DVDs to Blu-ray DVDs and charge a little bit more, and we'll put like a few special features and we'll get a couple more bucks from people.
So like incrementalism as opposed to innovation.
Yeah, or, you could call that innovation, but it's incremental innovation as opposed to like really true, like, let's rethink the experience. And so the same thing was true of like all the people who worked to make movies. They had spent a lot of time in college and in their internships and apprenticeships, moving up the ladder and kind of getting more status themselves. And so they would get very used to like the camera or the editing equipment that they knew. And if you tried to give them something else, they would kind of say, oh, this is not really for me. I don't really think I want to use this digital camera that you've just invented. And so lots of resistance to change, just as people are well paid and comfortable and busy and they know how to do their job, like there's a lot of resistance to new ideas. And I just think that's something that any of these internal corporate innovators that we've been talking about has to grapple with. People know how the company makes money. In Hollywood, it's to make blockbuster movies. It's not to make small little $1 million, $10 million movies that may or may not happen to break through as a hit. It's to create lots of merchandise. And I would even say, like, it's still pretty true that a lot of movies come out nowadays without much digital, like there's just a huge opportunity, right, to have digital content that kind of would surround and extend the world of a movie that comes out, whether it's a game or videos or podcasts or whatever. And Hollywood still hasn't really figured that out because their product is like the 2-hour long Marvel movie that gets released on July 4th weekend.
So the mindset is still very much there. And yet, as a consumer, it feels to us like there are 100 revenue streams coming off of every film, from lunchboxes to action figures to joint deals with McDonald's to sneakers. And I mean, not to mention the product placement that's inside the movie. It feels like there's so much revenue that comes off dripping off of one, 90-minute movie.
Yeah, but I think most of those revenue streams have been in place for like 20, 30, 40 years. And so they're just being maximized. I still think that digital and all of the user generated content around films is kind of like an untapped opportunity. And also just making short form content, like most movie studios, even the big animation studios, like they're still not in this cadence of like, hey, we should be making a lot of short form content for people's mobile phones or for them to watch every evening on Netflix. They spend like 3 years making like the big blockbuster movie that comes out Christmas week or July 4th week. And that's a lot of money to bet on, like one product and its success.
Right. And pretty much one weekend until it starts opening in other markets. Yeah. So do you miss it? Do you miss the glitz, the glamour of Hollywood?
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting industry. Like, I love what we get to do now, which is cover, at Innovation Leader, cover lots of different industries, like from companies like Starbucks and Marriott and, yes, entertainment companies like Disney, but also energy companies thinking about how solar and wind are going to change the game in their industry. But I do miss like getting to go to awards shows or just fun events on studio lots. It's kind of I think Hollywood is unique because like it does have this physical history, these historic places, the studios, where you go there and you can think about like how many, and even see sets that are still there from movies that were made 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think a lot of companies, right, you go in their headquarters and maybe they have some old historic photos on the wall, but you just don't have that same sense of like place and, oh yeah, this is the same lot that Gone with the Wind was filmed at, or Wizard of Oz, or, some of the real classics.
Yeah. And your experience has also taken you to write for so many different publications, not just the Hollywood Reporter, but the Times and Wired and Fast Company and Harvard Business Review and CIO Magazine. So many different places where you've shared content, Scott. And I'm curious, do you think also just from the disruption of the media space and how innovators receive information, how is an innovator expected to keep up with innovation? Obviously, reading Innovation Leader helps, but I'm just curious what you think about how do we do it? How do we keep our finger not just on the pulse today, but what's happening next?
Well, I mean, we all have become huge consumers of information, whether it's, I can't even count how many different things I subscribe to right now and check many of them every morning on my laptop or on my phone, podcasts that you read, webcasts that you participate in. I do think most of the smart people that I know are really good note takers or have some idea of, I'm going to have a set of Post-it notes up on my wall, or kind of a mental model of like, what are the big changes that I see happening or my clients are telling me about that feel like they matter, and that they just kind of have a lens for like, these are the changes that I'm seeing in my corner of the world. That does come through reading and listening and watching a lot of stuff and tuning out a lot of noise of things that don't really matter to you or to your colleagues or to your clients. It is a tough time right now. I kind of have been thinking a lot about, I'm going to an in-person event later today. And so we'll see what, those are still a little bit strange in the post-COVID era, if that's what we're in, because people, all they want to do is talk about how nice it is to see other people in 3 dimensions again. And they talk about the COVID protocols of the event. But I do feel like in-person for me is just such a great way to get signal in a way that I can really understand it and fit it into my mental map, like from sitting with somebody at coffee or in a hallway at a conference, just because stuff lands a little bit differently than it does when it's just part of this crazy Mississippi River of content that's flowing by all of us 24/7. And I just find those in-person conversations, maybe I'm overweighting them because they're in-person conversations and I'm a people person,
and it's been too long.
But often that does, like those conversations in a room full of people or just with one person, help me synthesize and like figure out what feels important directionally.
Yeah. And it's true. Separating the signal from the noise is really hard.
Yeah, because there's a lot of noise right now. And so I feel like one of the approaches we've taken in Innovation Leader is kind of a less is more approach, where we're not trying to publish 5 or 10 stories every day, but it's like, let's publish 3 really good things a week where, we're presenting something that you can listen to or watch or read, and we'll try to get you up to speed with what other big companies are doing.
Yeah. And the reason I ask is, this is the place called Innovation Storytellers, and you are certainly one of them, is trying to figure out those stories of value, and then also helping leaders on the inside convey what their teams need to be looking at, what they need to be thinking about, and how to create those assessments about what really matters. And so I like what you said about, while companies need to move faster when working with startups, we might need to get a little bit slower in the content that we consume about what's going to have an impact on our business. And I'm curious how you have seen some of the leaders who work in innovation, who take the content that you're sharing with them, how they make that apparent to their teams. I was just reading an article about Harley Davidson. I was just reading an article about J&J. What are some effective mechanisms you think, as a storyteller in this space, that innovation leaders on the inside can get real with their teams, can share really great data with their teams, perhaps in new ways, especially since their teams are so dispersed and so distracted than ever before?
Well, I think the paramount thing is authenticity and casualness
Mm.
and being real in conversations is so much better than the executive who has a talk track document about here's what I'm supposed to say in this meeting or this roundtable with my team. And so I do feel like if you're in Zoom land or you're in Microsoft Teams land, structuring conversations so that people are not just listening, but they're contributing and talking and maybe chatting in the chat stream or voting on stuff or adding post-it notes to a mural or Miro board and being real is so much better than, I don't know, I just interact with so many large companies where you can tell there's like 58 layers of polish before someone says something to an external party like us when we're interviewing them. And I think even internally, there sometimes are 24 layers of polish before someone says something to their team. And so trying to reduce that is probably a good goal, just being more authentic and spontaneous and casual and real in these conversations and meetings. Everything has gotten a lot more real over the last 18 months. And the other thing I would say is just these innovation groups, and sometimes consultants are to blame for this, is they sometimes just get distracted by some of the words that sound good, like innovation culture and innovation strategy. And they come up with their own language around like, whatever, we are the transformation tiger team inside the company. And we both have seen this, right? Where the language gets a little bit fuzzy and people forget that there are some end goals that the senior leadership expects us to deliver on. And whenever we survey people about what those end goals are, they tend to get really down to brass tacks pretty quickly. It's like, are you helping us grow revenue? Are you helping us reduce costs? And then other concrete stuff. Are you helping us bring in new kinds of talent to the company? Are you helping increase our net promoter score or loyalty? But they want there to be real outcomes. And so I think having that in mind and making sure that you're not straying too far from those expected outcomes is really important for the corporate folks and the consultants that they work with to just never take their eye off that ball. And, I think that's just becomes dangerous when those things get too separated, the activity and the storytelling that you're doing versus the brass tack results that leadership expects from all of this.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation theater going on. And sometimes we get caught up in the talking rather than in the doing of it.
Yeah, I think it's been a great time for all of the stars of Shark Tank because I think many companies will hire like Kevin O'Leary or Damon John or the stars of Shark Tank to come and present or judge at like these internal corporate Shark Tanks, which I've seen it happen, But yeah, so I think there's a lot of that theater that doesn't really deliver results, but feels very showy.
Well, I guess for you and me, it's showtime because I'm going to put you on the hot seat, Scott, as we do with all of our guests here on Innovation Storytellers. So I want to ask you, put your historical thinking cap on for a moment. And I want to ask you, what is historically, from any time from zero to now, what is the greatest innovation of all time?
I would have to say printing, the printing press, just as a way to start globally distributing knowledge and helping people all around the world get smarter. Other stuff obviously has built on that, but I would go with the printing press. A
good one. Innovation team you would have loved to have been a part of.
That's such an easy one. I think it would have to be, I'm a big theme park person. I grew up in Florida where, every vacation is to Disney World. And so I would go with like the original Imagineering team that Walt Disney put together when he was conceptualizing Disneyland in the 50s.
Wow. To build the parks, to be there and know that no one's ever going to see the garbage taken out. No one's ever going to know where all the actors are coming from before they pop up in their uniforms and stuff. Yeah, that's fascinating.
And it sounds fun. I've gotten to meet a few of the people who worked with Walt in that era.
Wow.
And it sounds like it was a lot of like both high pressure, but also a lot of fun.
Wow. And so for today, what do you think is an innovation that you would love, love, love to see? Something that would either make your life or humanity's life easier? What's an innovation you'd love to see in the world?
I think nuclear fusion as a source of energy, which people here in the Boston area and elsewhere are working on, and just other sources of energy that don't involve burning fossil fuels. I think that's the important one. And it's really encouraging to see, like that's where Bill Gates is putting a lot of his money. He has a few $billions in this firm called Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And hopefully a lot of larger companies are investing in kind of what the next generation of not just electric vehicles, but there's all kinds of generators in our world and other sources of carbon that we need to work on pretty quick.
Yeah, if we want to hang out on this big blue marble for a while.
I know, and keep innovating for like another couple millennia. That would be good.
That would be good. So, Scott, what else is going on at Innovation Leader? Anything else that we should know about? And how can people get in contact with you?
Well, I'm pretty easy to follow on Twitter. I'm at Scott Kirsner or scott@innovationleader.com if you have ideas about what we should be working on. And for us, we're resuming some small in-person events in cities around the US. And so we're kind of dipping our toe back into the water with small executive forums in places like Boston, Chicago, Atlanta, New York. And also we've been expanding our focus. I think initially for the first few years, we were all about people who had innovation in their titles, but lately we've been producing a lot more content for people with sustainability and strategy and emerging technology in their titles. So that's a big part of our focus, is just kind of making the tent a little bit bigger, because there's lots of people, lots of different titles that have this core responsibility for envisioning the future and making change happen inside large companies.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to Innovation Leader because I know certainly going through the pandemic and getting, to be able to sit in on a 30-minute call with the head of innovation at a Fortune 500 company and just hearing what's on their mind and what's on their plate and what do we do in the midst of this and how do we support our communities in light of coronavirus and all the shifts that were taking place for their workers around the world. It was just such an amazing community to kind of step into for 30 minutes on a Thursday and have a little lunch and learn with really brilliant people at IL and, the companies that and connect with so well. So I'm grateful to have been able to spend some of those 30 minutes with those leaders. There were a lot of fodder for ideas on my end. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being part of them. And thanks also for doing this awesome podcast. I've enjoyed listening to it. And so it's been fun to be on it.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. And if you like the show today, please tell all your friends, like it and share it. And if you didn't, then never mind. So Scott Kirsner, thank you so much for joining us today, and come back around for another round of innovation storytelling.
Thanks, Susan. It was a lot of fun.
This innovation story has ended, but yours is just beginning. Go to innovationstorytellers.com, download the free Innovation Storytelling Blueprint, and sign up to pre-order Susan's book, Innovation Storytelling. Get the resources, runway, and recognition you deserve. Due out this spring. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until the next innovation story.